Today I want to talk about how I prepare a board for painting. I have two things I do. One is using a gessoed board. So I'll talk about the types of boards I use, how I prepare them in the gesso, and then how I apply it. Also, how to make a canvas board by gluing the canvas onto a board. So today I want to talk about how I prepare a canvas board for painting. And I have all the stuff here I use. And I want to talk about the process, kind of show it a little bit, and then down below I'll have a PDF of what I use and where I get it. First off, the boards that I use hard boards. And this is a piece of Masonite, which is a brand name. Masonite is a hard board, but there are different types. And it comes in 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch. I tend to use the 1/8 inch unless I'm going to be painting on a board bigger than 20 by 24. Then the board can warp, and using the 1/4 inch is a little bit better. Now, the Masonite itself has a grid on the back. It's a real rough grid, and I think it makes it a bit stronger. They do have hardboard that doesn't have a grid. It's the same on both sides, and you can paint on either side. This one you want to stick on the smooth side, although I was at a show sometime back of the marine painter Frederick Waugh, really good painter, and he had some really large pieces that he painted on the back side of Masonite. And he painted in the 30s and 40s, so they were using it back then. But it really allowed him to load the paint on, get it very, very textured, very, very thick. It's like using an extremely heavy textured canvas. And it looked pretty good. And I haven't tried painting on this side. I don't think it'd be very good for a small painting, but maybe for a larger painting, that texture could be helpful to hold more paint. But anyway, I use the smooth side. Now this Masonite, the brand name Masonite, the hardwood, comes with a little bit of a coating on it anymore. It didn't used to. And it seems like kind of a light plastic coating of some kind. I'm sure it's sprayed on, but that has to be sanded off. So I use 180 grit sandpaper to take that off, and it doesn't take long. This board here is an 8 by 10, and it probably took me a minute to sand it off. So it doesn't take much, but you do need to sand that off. Now these come in the store. I get it from Home Depot. Lowe's will once in a while have it, but not very often. Your local lumber yard might be the least expensive place to buy it, but I get these at Home Depot, and they come in 4 by 8 foot sheets, and you can have them cut it there maybe 2 or 3 times, but they won't cut it up into, a bunch of 9 by 12 sizes for you. So you have to get it home and find a way to cut it. And I have a table saw here in the studio, and if you're adverse to heavy power equipment, using it, because it is loud and it can be a bit scary if you're not used to it, but they have small ones. They even have a tabletop table saw that's a lot lighter, less loud, less intimidating. They also have hand saws, power hand saws, like a skill saw, or even a powered scroll saw, which are a little bit lighter and less intimidating. And they make powered hand saws now that are really small and easy to use. So find some way to get it cut. Just don't lop off any fingers. Now the other board I use is MDF board. It's a little bit lighter, looks and feels a little bit different. I don't know what the difference is. They're both just compressed wood, but this is slightly different. I do know that if you get this wet, the MDF board, it will expand and ruin the board. Not so much the Masonite, I'm not sure why. But when you gesso these, and I do the same thing with the Masonite, I want to make sure to seal the sides as well, so water doesn't doesn't get in there. This is 1/4 inch. You can see it's a lot thicker. And if I'm doing like a 20 by 20 or bigger, I'll use 1/4 inch or 20 by 24 or bigger. You can also, if you do a bigger board, because the bigger you go with the board, the more problem you might have with warping. I think once it's framed, it's pretty good, although I've heard of paintings warping within the frame. But you can do what's called cradling. This is a commercially prepared cradled board, but this is a piece of masonite, and it's got strips of wood on it that's glued, mitered and glued to the board. And that'll prevent it from warping. And I would do that if I'm doing a bigger board. You can also gesso both sides, gesso the back, a couple of coats, and that'll help prevent warping as well. I tend to go to stretched canvas, or I glue canvas to a board if I'm going bigger than 20 by 20. So for preparation of the board to paint on, we have to seal it. The gesso is the primer, but I seal the boards with golden GAC 100. It's an acrylic primer and extender. I don't know what that is. I'm not an acrylic painter, but this is how I was always told to prepare boards. It needs to be sealed. And they have wood sealers like polyurethane or shellac. And I've tried painting on shellac before. It does seal the wood and you can paint on it, but it's extremely slick. And so to seal the wood with shellac or polyurethane, then put the gesso on, I don't think it adheres as well. The gesso gets kind of slippery. But this works real well. It's textured and it's an acrylic product, so I think it goes well with the gesso. Now I've done this one already. Put the GAC 100 on there, and you can see the brush strokes. It does give a nice texture. I don't know why you couldn't paint on this, why it has to be, because I kind of like the dark tone, sometimes that dark warm tone on there. I put this on first, usually just one coat. If it's a big board, I might put 2 coats on it, but one seems to work. And I want to apply it in different directions. And I'll use chip brush a lot of time. This is a 2-inch chip brush. I'll buy them by the bag. You get a dozen in a bag for, I don't know, 12 bucks. And this leaves nice texture on the board from the GAC 100. I use this more for the gesso. It gives me more of an even coat of gesso, and it works a little bit better. Smaller ones, I'll use the gesso with this brush as well. So now the gesso I use, right now I'm using Liquitex Professional Gesso. I've used Utrecht Professional Gesso, which I like. It's a lot thicker. The other gesso is Golden Gesso. So those three, the professional grade of those three, Golden, Liquitex, and Utrecht is very good. This one again has the GAC 100 on it. So I'm going to prime this board, and I'm going to use the better brush. And I probably want 2 to 3 coats on here, depending on how thick I get it. I tend to put real thin coats on there of gesso. It's better to have several thin coats than one big, thick, heavy coat. The gesso, if I get it too thick, the brush strokes seem kind of rubbery, and I don't think takes the oil paint very well. So I put it on thin. But what I don't want to do is thin the gesso with a lot of water. It doesn't adhere to the board as well when you thin it. So the stronger the better. If I have a bigger board, I will dip my brush in the water first, shake it out, then I'll dip it in here, and that thins it down slightly. But do not add water to the gesso. It has to be full strength. One thing you want to do before you gesso is get paintings and frames out of the way so I don't get gesso splatter on my frames. That doesn't work real well. So I can dip the brush in there a little bit, shake most of it off. If you have to thin it for whatever reason, I really never have to thin it. But I want to start applying the gesso and use a variety of brush strokes. I don't want to go all one direction. I want to make sure everything's covered. This first coat will dry really quick because the board will suck it up, even with the golden GAC 100 on it. And when I thin the paint down, what I'm doing is spreading it out to thin it. So when you think thinning the paint, getting the edges too covered. So when you think to thin the paint, or the gesso, you thin it by spreading it. Don't thin it by adding water. And I want to go different directions, lightly go over it, and then let that dry. All right, I have another board that's already dry, but this is the first coat, very thin. You can kind of see the tone of the board underneath. And there's a little bit of texture from the GAC 100 and a little bit of texture from the gesso, but I don't want too much texture because this is a small board. Unless I'm doing a larger board, I don't want to try and create a texture on there. But now I will get the second coat and do the same thing. I don't want to get it on and leave it real thick. I want to put it on somewhat thick and then just keep spreading it, going different directions. I don't want a uniform brushwork on there or texture, so kind of drag it around. If it's a bigger board and you want more texture, you could put it on somewhat thick, leave it in bigger clumps, and then as it semi-dries in about 1.5 minutes, you could drag a brush through it. And that creates a lot more texture for a bigger board. But this, I really don't need a lot of texture on an 8x10 or a 6x8 or even a 9x12. So in different directions. Some artists will go vertically one way for the first coat and then horizontal for the next to get the kind of grid pattern of a canvas texture. I've not tried that, but I do like the varied brushwork on there. And then that creates enough texture. And I would probably put one more coat on it as well, although I think 2 is enough because you also have the layer of the GAC 100 on there. Okay, now I want to talk about how I glue a canvas to the board. And I use the same kind of board as I would gesso. It's a piece of hardboard or Masonite brand hardboard. And it has the coating on the front that makes it real slick that you have to sand off. And I use 180 grit sandpaper. And it took me maybe a minute to sand it off. So it's not very labor intensive to sand that off. And I usually will get a full sheet, cut it in half, and I'll sand with a electric sander a half a sheet at one time. It just saves time. But anyway, get that plastic off because it's just too slick and the glue won't adhere as well. This makes it slightly porous when you sand it a little bit. Then the glue I'm going to use, I generally use the soft gel from Golden, semi-gloss medium. And it's a good adhesive and it's acrylic, so it doesn't have any acid in it. Any kind of white glue would work. Elmer's Glue All, it's a white glue. Anything that's yellow or brownish like wood glue is going to have stuff in it that will eat away at the canvas. So you don't want to use any other kind of glue than what's white. Bookbinder's glue is good. Miracle Muck, which is an art product. I've never used it though, but I hear it works. But I do the same thing here. Before I put the glue on, I have to add this also, like I did when I gessoed the board. I used the GAC 100 from Golden, and that seals the board. So I want to seal it before I put canvas on it as well. It doesn't take much. but takes a little more than what I just poured on it. And as long as you brush it out smooth, there's really no trick to this. And making sure it's totally covered. Don't leave any edges uncovered. Get the whole thing sealed. And I typically will do the sides as well. I don't want any brush hairs in there. This brush does tend to leave some once in a while. Can create a texture underneath your canvas that would be unfortunate. So now I use several different types of canvases depending on the size and what I want to achieve in the painting. And I'll experiment too, try different canvases. So you have to find out what works best for you, whether it's oil primed or gesso primed, real fine canvas, or more of a medium weave or heavy weave. I do have a medium weave that I use from Frederick's, and it's gesso primed, and it's fairly heavy. I probably wouldn't use this on a canvas unless it's 20 by 24 or bigger, because it's textured, and too much texture in a small painting will kind of take over, and you'll lose a lot of your image with too much texture on a smaller board. Then I have, also from Frederick's, it's a Red Lion. It's a synthetic canvas with gesso or some kind of universal primer. And I like that. It's a little finer, not as rough as the medium-sized canvas from Frederick's. Then I use Centurion, has an oil-primed roll of canvas that I use. Sometimes it'll be oil, sometimes I'll buy gesso. So the Centurion's a little less expensive, but try different ones and see which one works best for what you want to do. So I've cut the piece of canvas so it's bigger than the board, at least by 1/2 inch, and put that there. Then when it dries on the board, I can trim it pretty easily. So I want to apply again, it's golden soft gel medium. I just want to make sure it's all covered, especially on the edges or close to the edge. A lot of times that will be left unglued, and you have some of the canvas along the edges that aren't tight on there. And you have plenty of time to put the canvas on before this starts to dry. I mean, not unlimited, but I usually have the canvas cut already, so I don't put the glue down or the medium down and then have to stop and cut the canvas. That might take too much time, and this will start to dry. But make sure, especially close to the edges, it's really covered. Then I get the canvas and place it on there. Now the key is to get the air bubbles out. Make sure there's nothing like any kind of dirt or grit that's on the back of the canvas. You put it down and then it's kind of lumpy. And you got some time. If I do feel something lumpy in there, I can peel it off, take that off, and then put it back down. So it's not like the glue is instantaneous, and I do have something right there that's on the board. So I'll add a bit more glue. Then I will get a rolling pin I got from Walmart and just roll out the edges. Plus it really presses it into the glue a lot better. Then I'll get a board that's bigger than my board. This is 10 by 12. This is 11 by 14. And I'll put it smooth side down. Put it on there and then apply a weight. And that's 20-pound weight. It's plenty of weight for what I need here. So just some large art books would do, some bricks. And then I tend to leave it overnight. I imagine a couple of hours is fine. But I'll usually spend a day doing a bunch of these, stack them up that are the same size, put a weight on them, and just leave them overnight. Okay, now the board has been sitting here overnight with the weight on it. So we will trim off the excess canvas. And when you put the glue, or in this case the medium as the glue on the board, make sure there's not a lot of extra glue coming out here or coming down onto the canvas, because when you put the board on top, it'll stick to that. So make sure all that's kind of cleaned before you put the weight on it. Then I've got a box cutter here, and just keep your fingers out of the way. And just kind of hugging the edge of the canvas board here. Careful not to cut into the board. Helps to have this cardboard underneath so I can put the blade in kind of deep so it doesn't come out and cut into the hardboard. And I'm able to do it in one cut. Got a pretty sharp blade, but don't press down real hard to where you're kind of shaking. It's better to do 2 or 3 or 4 light cuts than to press down too hard. You kind of lose control of the blade. This one's pretty sharp, so I'm able to do it in one cut. Then there are usually some spots on the board where the glue didn't quite take. And right there. And I don't know why. I thought I got it covered. So what I'm going to do is get the medium again, dip the brush in it, and just touch up that area. Really get underneath of it so it goes as far as it'll go. I think that's the only one. And I put it on pretty heavy. And just wipe off the excess medium. And I can put a little weight back on it again, but it's usually good to go after that. I don't have to do much to it, but I could put even a smaller weight on there and let that sit for about 10 minutes or so. That's how I prepare boards, both gessoed and gluing canvas to the board. And down below, I'll have a PDF you can download to see where I get the supplies or what materials I use and where I get them.